So now I'd like to introduce you all to Sabbatical Ghosh, who is a fourth-year student in our PhD program in the School of Education in the Learning and Mind Sciences, and he has excitedly agreed to introduce Dr. Megan Welsh to us. So go ahead, Sabbatical.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Happy Monday, and thank you for coming to today's seminar. As Dr. Martinez said, I'm Sabbatical, a fourth-year PhD student here at the School of Education. And it's my pleasure to introduce my advisor and today's speaker, Dr. Megan Welsh. Dr. Welsh received her PhD in educational psychology from the University of Arizona in 2009, and then was an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut from 2008 to 2014, and is now an assistant professor at UC Davis's School of Education. Her research is in educational measurement and assessment, with a particular focus on using and understanding assessment as a means for educational reform. She received the campus-wide award for excellence in service to graduate students in 2019 and was named a Chancellor's Fellow for the 2019 to 2020 school year. And I can say from personal experience that Dr. Welsh is a deeply cherished mentor and a deeply thoughtful researcher. From 2019 to the summer of this year, Dr. Welsh was in Paris conducting research at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And today she'll be presenting work from that experience. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Megan Welsh.
Hi, everyone. I don't have screen sharing. If it's possible to get it, that would be helpful. There we go. So I think a lot of you know me. I'm Megan Welsh, and one of the things you might know about me is that I can be a little, what's the right word, enthusiastic about methods and about the importance of exploring lots of different quantitative methods. And I've wanted to, for a while now, give a talk, practice giving a talk that is methods oriented, but that is also just accessible to the whole School of Ed, because we all are expert methodologists in lots of things, but I'm sort of a heavily quantitative researcher. So I'm gonna try, and we'll see how this goes today. So so let's just see how it goes. Okay, so the name of the talk is Averages Overrated, What Factors Affect Mean and Variation in Performance. And the goals I have for the talk is A, to provide just a little bit of information about my sabbatical, and then share a new approach to quantitative analyses known as the location scale model, and then provide an example of what it can do. And so the example I'm going to provide is an example from an OECD data set, but it's not exactly the analyses from my sabbatical project, because I wanted something that was a little simpler to understand. And to gloss over some details that I would normally not gloss over if I was giving a formal quantitative methods talk. So let's just start with my sabbatical. So my sabbatical was in Paris at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. It's an intergovernmental economic organization that was founded in 1961. And its purpose is to stimulate economic progress and worldwide trade. If you were to talk to people about the OECD who knew Paris, they would think of this very, very beautiful building that the education people don't get to work in. But this is sort of its main building. And there are 37 member countries to the OECD. So this is an organization that's kind of like the UN, except it's focused on economics and on research and growth. This picture is the building I got to work in. If you've ever worked in bureaucracies related to education, the education people always get the worst building. The inside of the building was nice though, but it's okay. So what I was there to do was to study the PISA test and to do work alongside some OECD staff related to the PISA test. And so here we go. So what you should know about the PISA test is that it's a worldwide assessment of 15-year-olds. So it's trying to study people who weren't close to the end of their formal schooling, K-12. And it focuses on three core areas: reading, math, and science, and then also something called the innovative domain. When I was there was like at one point a Facebook announcement about me being there, and there's a picture of me with some people, and they work on this innovative domain. I'm not going to talk about it much today, other than to say that the assessment's administered every 3 years, started in 2000. And the way that it's designed is that reading, math, and science are offered every year, but there's like a focal area each year. So whatever and it's done on a rotation. So in the upcoming year, I believe it's going to be, the 2018 reading was the focus. I think the next one's math. But the reading focus, what they did is that there's like more questions related to reading, and then the other areas. And there's like a whole big redesign of the whole test to sort of account for different differences in our understanding of what it means to read, for example, or to be skillful in reading. And then the innovative domain changes every cycle. So if you're interested in a particular thing that is not reading, math, or science assessment, you can get information to compare countries from the innovative domain. The most recent innovative domain, the data that have been published from 2018 have to do with global competence. There's one coming up the next one that will be administered is going to be in creativity. And in prior years, there have also been some like creativity and problem solving types of tests. And like I said, it's an intergovernmental organization. This is an old photo, but one thing that's kind of interesting to me is that there are the 37 OECD countries, and they get to make all the decisions about the test. So they approve any changes that need to be made and how to spend money. And then there are a whole bunch of other partner countries that pay to have the test administered, but they don't actually get a say in how the test functions. They don't get a say in what the innovative domain function does. They don't get a say in how we define reading, et cetera, et cetera. But when they make these big decisions, something that I thought was kind of fun and interesting is that literally it does look like the UN, right? There are representatives from each country who attend meetings to discuss the test a couple times a year. And if you get to attend one of these meetings, I don't know if you can see this guy with gray right here with a headset, but they actually have the headsets with the translators so that if you don't speak the language, it gets translated in. I got to go to a PISA launch and watch and wear one of those headsets. The language of PISA, of the OECD, is English and French. And when they did the launch, I got to hear a discussion between the Secretary General of the OECD and France's Minister of Education. It was all in French. And I don't know if you've ever experienced having someone translate for you, but it was the total experience where like there's all these gestures and they actually look kind of grumpy. And then the translation is like very direct, like it's 5 words instead of the 30 words that were used. And I asked my colleagues later, were they berating? Was the Secretary General of the UN berating the French Minister of Education? Because that's what it seemed like. And they're like, well, no, when you add in all the other French words, it's actually quite friendly. But anyways, it was kind of cool to sit there with the headset. And then the other thing to know about the PISA test, the thing that you probably are familiar with, is that when scores get released, countries get ranked, right? So this tells us, you know, who are the most, in this map, the green are sort of the most, and this is from 2018, the most successful countries to the least, and then orange is sort of you're doing okay, and then red is, you know, you're one of the lower performing countries in the world. And so what you'll often see in the newspaper and what countries really pay attention to is both sort of their ranking, which is based on their mean score. And I think if you've ever paid attention to any assessment score, what gets published is some sort of ranking, right? This state is better than this state. This student is better than that student. This teacher is better than that teacher. Whatever the rankings are, they're ranked based on average performance. And just so you know, in case you didn't know, the US actually does not do as well on the PISA as many other countries. But the US is one of the biggest financial supporters of the PISA test because the amount that the countries pay is related to their the overall country wealth. And so we pay more and we don't do as well. It doesn't affect the outcome. Okay, so that's just a little bit about PISA. Does anyone have any question about the OECD? Does anyone have any questions about the OECD before I get into vocation skill model and the test and the results?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
From your previous image from the ranking of for the PISA test in 2018, I noticed that in Africa, there's no color, so it's not red, orange, or red. So why is there a lack of information available from the African countries?
That's a great question. So you only get to give PISA if you pay money for PISA. And so in 2018 up here, you can see that 78 nations paid for PISA. And so you have a color if the country opted in to taking PISA. And a lot of countries don't opt in. And we're going to get to a little bit about sort of countries' wealth in a little while. But what I would say is that you obviously have to have some wealth, I think, to give the test. I think some countries use this as their countrywide test. So the poorer countries, I believe what they're doing is they're paying someone else to handle all their testing for them. Although they still don't give the test to all the students. This is actually an important thing about PISA. PISA is not administered to every student in the country. There's a design by which kids are sampled to participate in PISA. So some students are selected in each country to take the test, and the country level scores are generated by taking an average across the students who are sampled. And so even if you pay money and it's your countrywide test, you're just finding out how your country does relative to other countries. You're not learning about the performance of individual students. Any other questions?
Megan, so a lot of people also look at the trend in mathematics and science study, and they compare these two international tests. And my understanding is that the PISA is supposed to be more about problem solving and not necessarily like regurgitating procedures. Is that correct?
That's a really good point that I should have brought up. So the PISA test is not supposed to be tied to any particular curriculum. It's supposed to really be about sort of thinking ability in different areas by the time you leave high school, and they've definitely stuck to that. And so when you look at like the so there are frameworks, there are documents that describe the content of each test. And those, like I said, they're updated on a rotating basis. So basically once every 9 years, reading is updated, and once every 9 years, math is updated, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that they do that is they bring in experts from around the world to help sort of think about what are the sort of key things that we consider to be areas that you have to be competent in each of these things, given current thinking. And they take a fair amount of their care with attending to the diversity of those advisory panels, especially the diversity with respect to country membership. I was staffing one of the panels related to the innovative domain while I was there, and women were definitely underrepresented, and people of varying race was also very much underrepresented. But the challenge that they had was that they would try to find researchers in countries that weren't the US. And once you at least in European countries and in like Australia, once you get people with PhDs who are staffing universities and who have the kinds of reputation, there aren't that many very high level people outside of the US who they can find in the areas that they want. And they take, because of this intergovernmental agency approach, intergovernmental approach, they really value representation from countries above all else. Other questions? Okay. So here's what I wanted to do now, was to talk about a new approach to quantitative analyses called the location scale model. And to do this, I wanted to sort of start with like an intuitive understanding. So what I was hoping is that if in chat, if you could, I've got a sample of 5 students from France and 5 students from the US with made up PISA scores. And let's just assume that 500 is average performance. And just in chat, if you could type what you notice about performance in France and performance in the US. And the reason for chat is because I would like everyone to think about it and everyone to type something. Okay. Right. So you all, okay. We have a rock star. So thank you, Rebecca. I'm assuming you mean me with the rock star comment, but that probably is just egotistical. So what we notice here, right, is that there's a lot less variability in France than the US. And I sort of designed this on purpose because what I wanted you to all see was that the means are the same, right? They're both 400, but that performance in the countries is not the same. And that's important in part because, in part because of this, right? That the performance is reported in terms of the average. So if those 2 samples were actually the full samples for each country, they would get the exact same score and sort of tie on the PISA ranking. But beyond PISA, the reason I think that this is important is that it's also that they would look the same on our analysis of most standardized test scores, and also in virtually all quantitative education research, because quantitative education research is all about predicting means. It's not about predicting variances. And our methods, the methods that we use, like literally don't think about what factors cause the variability to go up and down the way that we predict the extent to which average performance goes up and down. And so here's sort of a little bit more, just sort of discussing that. As I said, the main goal of quantitative research in education, and frankly in most social science, is to identify characteristics that are associated with differing performance on an outcome. But we do this by estimating the extent to which mean performance will be different for different groups. And it is the case that when we do that, we think about how much it explains variability. Like if I add this predictor of a mean in, does it help to explain variability I observe? But we don't actually take those same characteristics and say, for example, does race predict variance in scores the way that we ask, does race predict means? And I think that that's really important, because what the approach we use to studying something affects what we find. And then we present what we find, and people draw conclusions without taking other factors that maybe they should be thinking about into account. And so instead what you get is something like this from the OECD, where they do actually think about variability, and they do sort of say, okay, well, it turns out, I'm sorry, I keep moving my presentation view over the slide, and then I can't see it. So what we can see is how much variability in reading, and how much is in this case is the y-axis, and how much variability there is in economic and cultural status. And we sort of plot them and say, okay, well, we definitely see that greater variability in reading is associated with less variability in SES. But literally what we can do is like just graph it. And we don't have a way, until recently, we didn't have a way of capturing multiple factors that affect variation at the same time in a way that is easily digestible, right? You could spend a lot of time looking at each of these graphs and thinking about, oh, well, it looks like, for example, that the United Arab Emirates, right? They have a lot of variability in their reading scores, and they're very wealthy. So they've got rich kids essentially who aren't doing very well, and rich kids who are doing very well. And then we've got more situations where, for example, there's a lot of variability in SES in Luxembourg, but they're actually there's a lot of variability in wealth in Thailand, but the scores don't vary very much. So if you look at Thailand, well, does that mean that they're not varying, but they're all doing badly? Or does that mean that they're not varying and they've hit some sort of average level, right? Like it would be helpful to know for Thailand, if they have reduced variability, but they're performing on average similar to, say, the US, that would be a major accomplishment, right? Because now we've got all kids performing at a high level. But so that's one question we can ask. We can also think about, well, if there's less variability, we can see there's less variability there's a little bit more variability in SES in the US, but there's a whole lot of variability in performance. So what that means is that we have a variety of sort of income levels in the US, but we also have a whole lot of different kinds of performance. Questions about the point here, about what we're trying to think about variability and means, and what it means to have a high varying population that is variable in their performance versus a high varying population that's not variable in their performance.
The 99-point average is the average variability then?
The average,
like the standard deviation?
Yes, it's the average variability. So the 99 here is the average variability in reading performance. And the average variability of 0.93 here is the average variability in SES. And so what we're really doing here is saying, how much does SES, this way, what they're conceptually doing is how much does variability in SES predict variability in reading performance? And I think that that's a really useful way to think, right? Like how much does a kid's, I'm drawing on this by accident. How much does a kid's wealth, how much I think this is the PISA index. So it's an index of the student level SES. How much does the student level SES and variance in that affect variance in performance on the test? We could also just look at how much does directly, what we typically do is say, how much does SES predict average performance on the test? And we know from lots of studies that low SES predicts low performance and high SES predicts high performance. But we don't tend to think about how much does what predicts variability in performance. And that's, I think in education, a relatively new way of thinking.
I'm just having trouble wrapping my head around why Costa Rica and Mexico have greater variability than the United States when I think about income inequality in the United States as being so problematic. So,
I think that there are places where, where there's people who are very, very poor, and then there's a couple rich people, and that creates the variability. If it's, yeah. Remember that that variability is affected by the outliers a lot, right? So if you have some very wealthy people who are running the country and their kids are part of the test, then their wealth is going to increase the variability in their SES. What's interesting is that their variability in academic performance isn't very different. So the wealthy, I'm going to guess that I'm pretty sure that Mexico is a low performing country. And so that what that would mean is that the high SES kids, the system is not educating them as well either. And they're performing more similarly to the low SES kids in their country.
Megan, is SES just income?
So the PISA calculation of SES, they don't actually ask income. They've got 3 indicators they combine. One is the highest education, the highest education level of either of the parents. There's like they ask you what job your parent does, like categories of jobs, and then that job is related to an index of essentially what they assume the earning potential of the parents is. And then the third thing is a really long list of what things do you have in your house. And so if you possess a lot, then that probably means you're higher SES than someone who doesn't possess a lot. And all SES measures are problematic. And I would say that one of the priorities of the OECD right now is to revisit their index. So that obviously plays a role in this analysis.
I was curious because I thought I heard you say income, but I wasn't sure what exactly went into their SES metric. But also I wanted to ask a question too, like on variability. So then United Arab Emirates. So is there a way that I don't know exactly how to ask this, but it seems to me that does it matter? I'll ask it that way. Does it matter that the lower end of SES in some countries is going to be still appreciably higher than the highest levels of SES in another country, even if the variability, I mean, can the variability be the same, but does it matter that the low end and high end thresholds would be different?
I mean, that could affect the variability for certain, right? If I think about just sort of what I know from popular culture and reading newspapers about the UAE and Singapore and Qatar, those are very, very wealthy countries, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is what's sort of contributing to the less variability in these other indicator in the SES indicator. And it is, but also, Singapore, for example, Singapore is very proud of it. It basically wins the PISA every year, every time it's administered. It's one of the highest performing countries, and it's very, very proud of its high performance. And what happens is when you look at this though, like, I don't know, like that variability, I'm not so proud of that, right? Like it's much better to be very high performing and have actually educated all of the children that are tested, not just some of them. And so that's sort of the main point I wanted to make by looking at this. But the question about SES, I will have to warn you all that Gloria is a very, very smart person about school finance, and I use terms I'm not as fluent in a little bit too loosely. So if I say income again, I do mean SES, and I'm going to go over what goes into that measure in a second. Any other questions before we move on?
Thank you, Megan.
Okay, thank you.
Megan, there's a question on the chat around whether public school students, this test is given to only public school students in these countries, or if it's public and private.
I believe it's just public, but I would have to double check. There is what I will say is that there's a lot of attention. There's a very extensive technical document that talks about the sampling frame from PISA and what the rules are for sampling students. And one of the things that I did there is sort of not my sabbatical officially, was that when they think about sort of the technical quality of the test, it's all actually around that document, as opposed to sort of the psychometric quality of the test. I mean, they have a whole testing company that handles the psychometric quality. I'm not suggesting it's bad, but when they sort of think through all of the ways they're being rigorous, they attend more to that than to, and then they sort of trust the testing other stuff.
Megan?
Huh?
It's Erin. I just looked at the technical document for PISA, and there is a private school sample in the United States at the very least. So it is both public and private.
I apologize. Thank you for double checking that. So I will say, the other thing I will say is that there's a lot of questions around the quality of this country level measures related to who's sampled and who's not. And as I showed you with the PGB, it is a very political thing. Which for the purposes of what we're doing today, I just want to ignore. But I'm not suggesting that I'm in no way suggesting that I think that the country level scores are necessarily accurate. I mean, there's ways that you can poke holes in anything, and you can poke holes in their scores as much as anything else. Okay. But here's the thing, is we could simultaneously predict means and variances with this thing called the location scale model. And what you need to know about the location scale model is that it was actually developed for intensive longitudinal data, and essentially to measure sort of repeated measures over time to model them. So for example, this is sort of people being asked repeatedly about their negative affect, or getting a measure of their negative affect. And you're trying to just think about how negative affect fluctuates for each person over time. And what you can see from this graph, if we were to look at intensive measures of individuals, is that it varies a lot for some people, but stays relatively high. It doesn't actually change much for others. It starts off low and goes high, and there's others who sort of stay low, right? And what's interesting, right, is what this model is trying to do is to think about both what predicts having a high negative affect, and what predicts bumping around in your negative affect. Right? If you consistently feel negatively about things, that would suggest that you might do one thing, sort of one form of, say, psychological treatment with someone. And if your negative affect bumps around a whole lot, then it might be a different sort of psychological treatment, trying to think through how do I support people? What do I know what their triggers are for certain days, etc. And so that's sort of where it comes from, is specifically thinking about repeated measures of people. And so in that sense, we have this thing where we look at a location, which is stuff that characterizes an individual's average response. And so that's sort of the average differences between people and the variability between people. And then the scale that is focused on the repeated observations. So what's the average performance over time, and how does variability change for that person over time, or for individuals over time? And so this means that we estimate a couple of different things. We predict variability within people, those repeated measures, and variability between people. And so that allows us to think about the varying, we could apply a predictor or a set of predictors to variability over time, variability between people, and then within subjects, so time varying within a person, time varying between people, and also just overall variance between people. And the other thing to know about this model is that I learned about it by spending a lot of time with the quantitative psychologists at UC Davis. It's relatively, well, it's like a decade old. So it was first proposed by Hedecker et al. In 2008. And what we can see here is that it's really increasing in use in other fields. So I just did a Google Scholar search, and since 2019, there are, and you can see I sort of looked specifically for this term within quotes. There were 400 papers published since 2019 using this method. in education, what I've been thinking about in terms of applying it to education is, instead of thinking about repeated measures, thinking about student level scores as repeated measures of schools, as repeated measures of countries, as repeated measures of teachers. So I would take that. So what we would do instead is to think about variability between students and variability between country, school, or teacher, for example. So that allows us not only to notice that they are different, but to think about what predicts variation between them. And so that's sort of where I'm heading. And I'm noticing the time. I'm trying to I think hopefully I did this on time. Okay. So then we have just the formula for those of you who are interested in them. And so we have an outcome, for example, the response of person I at time J, or we could think about this as the response for the country for a given person. And then we've got different regressors, different predictors that we care about. And then we've got, we've got the parameters, and we've got the things we care about, and we've got the coefficient for them. And then we have what we call a random effect that's related to the location. And we've got a random effect that's related to the scale. And something just to know is the way that we make all this work is you actually have a formula that predicts that sort of takes that variation and adjusts it so that we can't have negative variance, because that would cause some problems. But then it allows for, again, at this point and this point, some predictors for the different variances, for the variability. Okay. I know that not everyone is going to love formula, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on. I just wanted to have it up here for people who might be interested. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about what this model can do. And what I've been doing, I'm going to give a warning here. What I've been doing is focusing on thinking about countries, right? And how can we understand variability between countries? That results in a very complex model because there are 63 countries, so there are 62 predictors just for the countries. And in addition to that, there's a lot of complicated sampling statistics involved in thinking about the PISA test. So related back to that framework, they actually try to do some statistics so that the sample, to make the samples reflect the population at large. And that makes the analysis complicated. So I'm not going to show you that. I'm just going to show you a similar analysis. Let's see. So what I would just say is that this is just an example. Here's the research questions. So how much does a country's wealth and a student's socioeconomic status affect the country's average mathematics performance and the variability in mathematics performance within countries? And the data I'm using is student level data from the 2012 PISA math test. It's designed to generate country level scores, and the student level scores are more tricky. If you were to open up a PISA data set, there would be 5 scores for each student. Well, in 2012, there's 5. It changes over time. There's 5 scores for each student. They're called plausible values, and each score represents like a different point on the distribution of like possible scores the student could get because of a complicated design where they want to ask more questions about math knowledge than could be asked to one student. So students get samples of the questions, they get pieces of the test, and then the information sort of aggregated up at the country level so that we can have more items than we'd be able to use with any one student. And so proper analysis involves sort of something complicated. A simple way of talking about it is that we'd run everything for each plausible value, and actually for sampling statistics. And then we have to average across all of those runs, the estimates we get across all those runs. And so I'm only going to use plausible value 1 in math for this presentation. And then in addition to the PISA scores, I'm predicting it with this measure of student level socioeconomic status. And it's a composite that looks at the student report of resources in the home, the highest education level of either parent, and then a rating of the parent's employment. So they've got this ridiculous list of possible job categories your parent could fall into, and you say which one it is. And there's this, and then basically what happens is if your parent is in a high paying job, you get a high score. And if your parent's in a low paying job, you get a low score on that part of the index. And then it's converted in this case to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And then also the per person GDP at the country level. So in this case, I got expressed in US dollars, and I got it from the International Monetary Fund website. And it's again standardized within PISA countries. So the numbers you're going to see, the mean is 0 and the standard deviation is 1, and that helps with interpretation. And then what we have to remember is that the sample, this picture I showed you is from before. This is actually from 2018, where there are 78 countries. In 2012, 63 countries participated in PISA, but it's some subset of this map. And there were 480,000 students who participated. And so then I just want to sort of go over the estimate and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. So this is a table. It looks like a regression table you might see that you would get from a location scale model. And you'll see that there's a couple of additional things that are estimated. So in this case, we can see that the average PISA score is 475 points. And that country wealth predicts higher average country scores. So the country score on average is going to go up if you're a wealthy country. But you can also see that it also increases variability between countries. And it increases, as much as it impacts the average score for the country equally to the amount that it impacts the variation within the country. So we saw, for example, that we could see that places like Singapore and the United Arab Emirates that are high achieving, that they actually were very variable in reading scores, right? I mean, sorry, high SES. They're very, they have a lot of variability in reading scores. And this is playing out right here, where you can see that being high SES actually spreads out the scores. So yes, we're higher performing, but also not for everyone. And then also for the student economic status, we can see that it also impacts sort of average scores, and it also impacts variability, but not within a country, but not at the same level as the country level wealth does. Any questions about this table? Okay. So then the discussion. So here's really the point I wanted to make. This I think I thought that I was hoping that poverty would be something that would be, or wealth would be something that would be interesting to the larger community of the school. But really the point is that our methods limit what we can know. And as researchers, the questions we pursue affect what everyone pays attention to. And by everyone, I mean other researchers, but I also mean policymakers and practitioners. And we tend to define things for people when we run analyses. And the location scale model is a model that allows us to value bringing all students to a high achieving level, and to think about systems in which high achievement comes at the cost of educating everyone. And that's just one model, but I think it's an important one. And methods, I guess methods matter. And that's why I do think, I make my students spend a lot of time in other departments listening to advanced quantitative talks. And hopefully they know a little bit about why already. But I do think it's important to attend to the innovative things that are happening methodologically, because they allow us to observe what's happening in the world in a new way, and in particular, I think sometimes in a better way than we have in the past. Okay, any questions?
Hi.
Maria?
How are you, Megan? Thank you for this talk. First of all, a comment. It's true how the information is delivered. How can we understand it so different? Because now I saw the map with the colors, and I realized that Chile, my country, was in red, low performing, And when I was in Chile, like in the newspaper, it appeared Chile, the best country in Chile about PISA scores. So it's like, for me, it's like, it's so clear how we can receive so different this kind of results. And my question is about the sampling methodology. Do you know if how is the process? I'm not sure if they ask for a representative sample for each country, and if OCDE is like linked with the government of the countries, or if you can tell us about that.
So I think what they would say is that they are going for a representative sample, and that's the reason they're so careful with their sampling frames. And in terms of what I was talking about the sampling, it's that there's a statistical method for sort of taking what the data you have and estimating what the result really is countrywide. And so that is what that's the part of this that's actually really complicated, because there are programs that allow you to do this, but not for the location scale model. So you have to do a lot of adjustments to make that work. So I think that they would say that they are, but there has been a lot of criticism of this test in particular as not being as good at that as it should be. One thing they have started doing, for example, specifically, I think because China had a reputation in particular of cherry picking, is they report by different specific Chinese provinces and cities separately. So Hong Kong is reported separately, Shanghai is reported separately, Taiwan is, which some of these places would not consider themselves to be Chinese, and I don't want to get into the politics of that because I don't know enough about it. But they do have some specific separate reporting that I think is intended to get at that. But it is a very political process, and some countries, in the US, I don't think we care that much about PISA scores, to be completely honest with you. But in some countries, it's a very high stakes thing.
I think I'm just in the call time because we have a minute left, but I just want to simply wrap things up and thank Megan. Thank you, Megan, for your presentation. And thank you for fielding questions throughout. As a qualitative researcher, we tend to wait to the end, and I really appreciate how I know you and other colleagues will take questions throughout. I also want to thank you for sharing what you did during your sabbatical. I think sabbatical as a graduate student, I didn't understand what it was. I just knew my faculty mentors were away somewhere. So I really appreciate you sharing that as well.